Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I go over my best of one, best of three meta review for Standard, and we're on to week 5 of Tarkir Dragonstorm. Yesterday I misspoke and said Aether Drift, so those who caught that, good catch. And if you are new here, welcome. I've been doing this for over a year now. But what I do is I like to use a third-party tracker called Untapped, and this is a way I can kind of remove my bias. But I've been playing Magic the Gathering for almost 30 years, so hopefully I can give you some insights as well. And we'll kind of talk about how the decks have been performing, their matchups, what cards to look for in your opening hand. And then once we've covered best of one, we'll also cover the best of three tournament scene and hopes of kind of keeping a track of what's happening in the meta for paper as well. So this is specifically for Diamond and Mythic, and but you know they if it performs well in Diamond and Mythic, it tends to perform well at the lower ranks as well. So number one, according to the tracker Untapped in Tier 1 is Rakdos Aggro, and there are no changes to the list from week 4, so last week in Tarkir. And we've talked about this deck a fair amount, so I'm going to kind of blast through it if there hasn't been any changes, but I will talk about the matchups. So this deck is favored against Izzet Prowess. So Izzet Prowess has a go wide strategy that's a little bit slower than this one. This one tends to win on turn 3. And then it's also favored against Mono Red Aggro for a similar reason. It does usually win a turn sooner. And then Azorius Omniscience as well. Since Azorius Omniscience aims to win on turn 4, this deck wins by winning on turn 3. So this one is just a straight out race. I used this one earlier today to climb up to top 500 Mythic with a 60% win rate. The more that people tweak the amount of interaction in their deck to make themselves better against Azorius Omniscience, where the interaction is a dead card, then makes them weaker to the Rakdos Aggro pick. And just matchup wise, you're also there are answers to this strategy for sure. So this is weak to Mono Black Midrange and Esper Pixie, which both have interaction to shoot down your Slickshot Show-Offs and things that you are targeting with your Monstrous Rage or your Turn Inside Out, resulting in a 2-for-1, which is pretty hard to recover from. Boros Auras, also, this deck does not have any interaction outside of blowing up your own Cacophony Scamp, so it's a little bit weak to the Sheltered by Ghosts strategies in Mardu Aggro and in Boros Auras. And then Mono Black Demons is largely Mono Black midrange, but changing a couple of cards to make them a little bit more aggressive. It's also weak to that deck. And then it's weak to Jeskai Control, which is a new archetype that we've talked a little bit about in Best of 3. Still haven't seen it come up into the top 8 on the Best of 1 tracker. But I do think it will eventually get there, given enough time. So the opening hand, I recommend looking for your combat tricks. So Turn Inside Out is particularly nice. Same with the Heartfire Hero. Some lists in Rakdos Aggro are running the Manifold Mouse. That one's also good to have in your opening hand. Otherwise, Monstrous Rage and the Monastery Swiftspear. All right, number 2, according to Untapped in Tier 2, which means that it is a standard deviation below the Tier 1 Rakdos Aggro this week. But still a very viable deck. Even if you are in Tier 3 or Tier 4, you would be able to climb successfully to Mythic, just so you know. Mono Red Aggro, was in number 2 in Tier 2, and we also have no changes since week 4 of Tarkir. Honestly, no changes for quite some time with this archetype. It's favored against Izzet Prowess, being a little bit faster than the Izzet Prowess strategy. And then it's favored against Azorius Omniscience, being able to win before they're able to get the Boros Awakening off. And then it is also favored against Jeskai Oculus, which can struggle to keep up with the pressure of Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse. Is a pretty tough curve out. It's a coin flip, though, against the Esper Pixie and the Mono Black Demons deck, and that one has enough interaction to disrupt the curve out. And then it's weak against Mono Black Midrange, which has even more interaction. And then it's weak to Rakdos Aggro, like I mentioned, because Rakdos Aggro is a faster strategy. It is weak to Boros Auras as well, depending on whether or not you can disrupt their Sheltered by Ghosts with the Burst Lightning, and which they can also have the Shard Mage's Rescue to answer. So kind of see how that one pans out. And then it's also weak to the Jeskai Control build. So Jeskai Control's kind of out here praying, purposely designing itself to be good against the Mono Red Aggro matchup because of how prevalent it is on the ladder. And then your opening hand, you're looking for Heartfire Hero. Hired Claw is also a really good turn 1 to start with, and then following it up with the Manifold Mouse or a Monstrous Rage. Particularly the combination of Heartfire Hero with Manifold Mouse with the Monstrous Rage is a ton of damage. All right, number 3 in tier 2 is Mardu Aggro. And if we compare this one to last week's list, we can see that the Sunbillowed Verge has been replaced by the 4th copy of the Inspiring Vantage. It doesn't have a huge effect to bring in the Sunbillowed Verges. This archetype is favored against Izzet Prowess. I think Izzet Prowess is the most popular deck on the best 1 ladder. So this was, is a pretty good strategy for farming those wins. And then it's also favored against Mono Red Aggro, similar to Boros Auras because Mono Red Aggro struggles with the Sheltered by Ghosts. It is also favored against Rakdos Aggro, which also struggles with the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then it is favored against Boros Auras, but ever so slightly, because it's basically the same deck, but you can win a turn sooner by using the Callous Sellsword to fling one of your really beefed up Voltron dudes. And then it is also favored against Jeskai Oculus, which we have seen a little bit more of a return to because it's more of a popular deck in best of 3. But it also struggles a little bit with the Sheltered by Ghosts. So it's a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience, both decks aiming to kind of pop off on turn 4. And then it is weak against Esper Pixie and Mono Black Midrange, which both have the interaction to punish the Sheltered by Ghosts and resulting in a 2-for-1. And then it's also weak to Jeskai Control, which has the temporary lockdowns. And Mono Black Demons is also pretty good at having the interaction to disrupt the strategy, and then being able to remove the blocker with the Rakshasa if it does come to that. The opening hand is very similar to the Mono Red strategy, where you're looking for your Heartfire Hero, and you're also looking for your Sheltered by Ghosts. And then Optimistic Scavenger is a really good turn 1 as well. And Manifold Mouse to follow the Heartfire Hero is also a really good combination. All right, number 4 in tier 2 is Azorius Omniscience, and this one also has not seen any changes to the archetype. We do see a different one on the ladder, it just hasn't been performing better, but like this version is performing equally as good as the one that is bringing in the Roiling Dragonstorm and the Meringue River Regent and the mill enchantment that I'm blanking on. Anyway, so there's different variants of this deck, but this one is still performing quite well, and there's no changes from week 4. It's favored against Mono Black Midrange and Esper Pixie. So one of the things that some people have been calling for a ban in Omniscience, or this deck being too overpowered, partly because it's a combo strategy. So combo doesn't interact with your opponent particularly well, and some people find it to be a boring game. But if you don't have this deck in the meta, then there's nothing that's really keeping Mono Black Midrange and Esper Pixie in check. Because as we'll talk about, the only deck that those two are weak to is the Azorius Omniscience strategy. So they're kind of in here to keep the interaction-heavy decks in check. And then it's also favored against Boros Auras, and it's favored against Jeskai Control and Mono Black Demons. And a lot of that is because the more that you try to interact with this deck, the more that there really just isn't much to interact with. And unless it's interacting specifically with the Abuelo's Awakening on turn 4, and then the control has to figure out ways to shut this down over and over again. Now, it is a little bit of a glass cannon. There are definitely ways to build around to defeat this deck, but you kind of have to decide how heavily you're going to lean into graveyard hate. It's a coin flip against Izzet Prowess, which depends kind of on who's going first, since they both aim to win on turn 4. And then it's a coin flip against Mardu Aggro for the same reason. And it's weak against Mono Red Aggro, which wins on turn 4, but also has the ability to hold up the interaction to make Abuelo's Awakening not an instant win on turn 4. And then it's also weak to Rakdos Aggro, which wins on turn 3. And then the opening hand, if you are running the Roiling Dragonstorm, it's a really good one to have, just like Chart a Course. Abuelo's Awakening is really nice. It's the whole point of this deck. Omnisciences as well, because then it gives you things like your Chart a Course or your Roiling Dragonstorm, basically acting as additional copies of the Omniscience. Spell Pierce is really good if you are running that one, and then Chart a Course enables you to get the Omniscience into the graveyard, and Philology Archaeologist is a great way to mill while also slowing down your mono red opponent. Okay, number 5 is Esper Pixie, and this one's also in tier 2. And if we compare this one, we have to go back to week 1 of Tarkir, and that was the last time we saw it in the top 8. And every 4 weeks or so, we're going to see kind of a smaller sample size because of the way that, because of the season reset, there's less Diamond and Mythic in the following week. So that's kind of why we saw it on week 1 and why we're seeing it again on week 5. And so just keep that in mind that these are a little bit lower sample sizes. But this one, we do see some changes. So we've dropped the 1 copy of the Caves of Kolios. We've dropped a Concealed Courtyard, which is the Orzhov Fastland. We dropped 1 Nowhere to Run, which is the enchantment that gets rid of the hexproof. And then we've also dropped 1 Sun Pearl Kirin and 1 Restless Reef, which is the Azorius Manland. And then we've also got rid of Kaido, Bane of Nightmares, which does better in best of 3, does worse off in the aggro matchups. And then we've dropped all 4 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts. And really what this is saying to me is that we've made this deck more geared towards fighting the Azorius Omniscience deck than worrying about mono red. So we're bringing in 2 more copies of a Darker Wastes, which gives us a Painland in Azorius. We're also bringing in the Underground River, which is the Painland in Dimir. And then we're bringing in 3 copies of the Kutzel's Flanker. And this does help you stabilize against mono red because of the gaining 2 life and scrying 2. But really is the answer for when they go to take Omniscience out of the graveyard and you just wipe their graveyard with the Kutzel's Flanker. And we've also got, let's see, an additional Fear of Isolation, 2 Momentum Breakers, and this one, again, works well against certain archetypes by making them have an Edict, but also works at attacking Azorius Omniscience by going for their hand. And because if you can get rid of their entire hand, then they don't have enough pieces to make the combo work. And I've noticed that the one that uses the Meringue River Regent is a little bit less consistent than the Invasion of Arcavios, and at least is the one that it stalls out sometimes where they can't find their Founding of the Third Path. That was the card I couldn't remember. So this one's bringing in 2 more copies of the Corroding Dragonstorm, leaning more fully into bouncing enchantments, and then also is bringing in 1 Plains. So Esper Pixie is favored against Boros Auras and Mardu Aggro by having enough interaction, especially the Nowhere to Run, to disrupt the Sheltered by Ghosts, and then it is also favored against the Rakdos Aggro, similarly having enough interaction to stop the Rakdos Aggro strategy. So it is a coin flip, though, against the Izzet Prowess. That one has a little bit more of a go-wide aspect to it off of the Quarry Steel Cutter, and so it kind of depends on if they hit that card and are going wide, or if you're able to kind of reel them in. It's also a coin flip against Mono Red Aggro, kind of depending on who has the play, and then it's a coin flip against Mono Black Midrange, again, kind of depending on who hits the removal at what points in time. Same with the Jeskai Control and the Mono Black Demons. And then it's weak against Azorius Omniscience. So that's what I mean. Like, this deck would be the number 1. Everyone would be complaining about Esper Pixie if it wasn't for Azorius Omniscience. And your opening hand, you're looking for your turn 1 plays. So Hopeless Nightmare, the Storm Chaser's Talent, Optimistic Scavenger, and the Nurturing Pixie are all of your best opening cards in your opening hand. All right, number 6 is Boros Auras, and this was the one that was in the week 1 spot last week. So we can see that in Diamond and Mythic, we're actually having exactly what you hope to see, which is kind of a rotation of Azorius Omniscience and Boros Auras and Rakdos Aggro, kind of taking turns in the number 1 spot. And we see no changes to this list from week 4 of Tarkir. It is favored against Izzet Prowess, which doesn't have a whole lot, it has the bolt waves, right? But it has to race this deck, and does run the burst lightnings just like mono red. But if you're playing well as a Boros Auras player, then you can play around that and get your Sheltered by Ghosts down by holding up something like Shard Mage's Rescue when you go to play the Sheltered by Ghosts. It's also favored against mono red aggro for that same reason, and Rakdos Aggro because it has no interaction for the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then it's also favored against Jeskai Oculus, because Oculus has no answer for the Sheltered by Ghosts. It's weak against Azorius Omniscience. This deck doesn't usually win until a little bit later than turn 4, and then Azorius Omniscience has already popped off by then, and you don't really have a way of holding up interaction to disrupt their Abuelo's Awakening. It's also weak against Esper Pixie and Mono Black Midrange, since it's weak to interaction. And then it is weak to Jeskai Control for the same reason, and Mono Black Demons. And then its opening hand is very similar to Mardu Aggro. You're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Optimistic Scavenger, the Sheltered by Ghosts, and the Manifold Mouse. Alright, and then number 7 is Izzet Prowess, and this is the most popular deck on the ladder right now. And you can tell that a lot of the decks that I have mentioned have started off with being favored against Izzet Prowess. And for good reason, right? Because if you can beat the number 1 deck, the most popular deck, that's going to help you on your ladder climb, right? So the win rate of this has been knocked down because of how much of the meta is adapting to interact or counter the Izzet Prowess strategy. So if we compare this one to week 4, we do finally see some changes to this archetype, and as we'll talk about in best of 3, we're also seeing there's basically 3 different builds of this deck happening in best of 3. This one is leaning more. This one is the build that works better in best of 1 than the one that works better in best of 3, and we'll talk about why. Because 5 out of 8 of the top 8s this week were Izzet Prowess, so we'll have plenty of time to talk about the archetype over there. So this week we're dropping the 1 copy of the Into the Floodmaw, dropping 1 Stock Up, dropping 2 Mountains, and a Restless Spire, which is the Manland in Izzet. We're also dropping 2 Ops and the 2 Spell Pierce. And instead we're bringing in 4 Shock. So we have 4 Burst Lightning and 4 Shock. And this allows you to still have interaction to hold up at instant speed for Boilo's Awakening in Azorius Omniscience, but it also helps you counter the Mirror Match, where you're able to shoot the Slickshot Show-Off out of the sky, unless they have the Monstrous Rage. So we're also favoring 4 Sleight of Hands. The Sleight of Hand is sorcery speed, lets you look at 2 cards, whereas Opt is instant speed and lets you scry and then draw. So they're very comparable to one another. Sleight of Hand, though, most of the time that you're doing your double spelling, you're doing it on your turn, so the sorcery speed doesn't matter. And then because we're tweaking the lands a little bit differently here, we're bringing in 3 additional islands. So this strategy is favored against Jeskai Oculus. Really, that's the only deck in best of 1 that has a greater than a 3% change in win rate from 50%, like 53 and above for Izzet Prowess. The rest of them are mostly coin flips. So if you feel like, you're really just flipping a coin over and over with this deck, there's a reason. So it's a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience, largely depending on who hits turn 4 first. It's also a coin flip against Mono Black Midrange. That one has more to do with your Kori Steelcutter, so mulligan strategies can affect the matchups that I'm talking about here. Same for the Esper Pixie, and then Jeskai Control as well. And it also kind of depends on if the Jeskai Control hits the temporary lockdown or is running it. And then we also have it's a coin flip against the Mono Black Midrange or Mono Black Demons for a similar reason to the Mono Black Midrange, kind of depending on whether or not you hit your go wide or not. So it's weak against Mono Red Aggro and Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras. So Mono Red Aggro and Rakdos Aggro, because this strategy is a little bit slower than those two. And then weak to Boros Auras because this list specifically with the shocks is going to be a bit better than the one that's not running the shocks, because you do need to be able to disrupt that Sheltered by Ghosts. But because they have the Shard Mage's Rescue, it's not guaranteed, and generally is not. You have a hard time beating the life gain in the Sheltered by Ghosts deck of Boros Auras. So the opening hand, this list is not running the Drake Hatcher, and we're seeing more of Drake Hatcher happen in best of 3. So if you are running the Drake Hatcher, it's a really great one to have in your opening hand. You also have the Monastery Swiftspear is really great for this deck to start on turn 1. Kori Steelcutter is kind of the card that makes this whole strategy work. Stormchaser's Talent is also really good turn 1 play, and then the Slickshot Show Off is you can plot it, and it gives you kind of a really free, a nice easy way to trigger a double spell after plotting it. Not to mention that this can be one of your win conditions by how many 1-cost spells you have. All right, and last but not least is Mono Black Midrange, which is currently in tier 3. Again, I've seen plenty of people climb to Mythic with this deck. It does not mean that this deck is bad that it's in tier 3. So it is compared to week 1, which is the last time that we saw it in the top 8 along with Esper Pixie, because these decks have similar matchups. is Liliana the Veil got dropped by 1. We're dropping the 2 copies of the Mishra's Foundry to bring in the 2 copies of Soulstone Sanctuary, and then we're bringing in an additional Swamp. So we've seen some lists that cap out on 24, some that like to go to 25, and the Soulstone Sanctuary is a little bit worse against mono red and than the Mishra's Foundry, and but gives you demon synergies with the Unholy Annex. So this archetype is favored against mono red aggro and Rakdos Aggro, Boros Auras, and Jeskai Oculus. Anything that has a problem with dealing with the interaction of mono black, because this deck has the most amount of answers in creature-based answers and hand hate in the meta right now. And it's a coin flip against Izzet Prowess, again, kind of depending on if they hit the Quarry Steel Cutter. And it's also a coin flip against Esper Pixie, which kind of depends on how the removal lines up against one another. It's a coin flip against mono black demons, which is basically the same archetype except for you're running the Rakshasa on 3 and less of the Archfiend of the Dross. And it's also a coin flip against Jeskai Control, and that one also kind of depends on how the removal lines up. If you're able to get the hand hate to be able to disrupt the Jeskai Control is your best line in that situation. It's weak against Azorius Omniscience. So again, like Esper Pixie, mono black midrange is only kept in check because of the existence of the combo deck. So if we were to eliminate, if you do ever see a ban on Ablaelo's Awakening or Azorius Omniscience, it's time to start playing mono black midrange or Esper Pixies. And opening hand, you're looking for Unstoppable Slasher. It's part of your combination to win on turn 4, and is just all around a very sticky and an annoying threat. Duress is a particularly nice one to have. There's lots of non-creature cards to get from your opponent, so it's good to start on turn 1. And then Unholy Annex is particularly nice to have in your opening hand as well. And then Deep Cavern Bat. So you kind of have a nice little spread of... you noticeably the hand hate is performing a little bit better in the opening hand, and I think that has largely to do with how much Azorius Omniscience we're seeing in Diamond and Mythic. Basically, Izzet Prowess and Azorius Omniscience are your number 1 and number 2 decks at the higher ranks. All right, and so now for best of 3. And what I do every week for best of 3 is, unless there's a large tournament, I usually just look at the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. It's a very competitive tournament, and it's a pretty good way of keeping track of what's going on in best of 3. So, Izzet Prowess by CMAC. This one took down several. They took down first place and then second place on the following day or on the same day. Anyway, this was first place standard challenge on May 9th, and if we compare this one to last week, we can see that they did take the deck in a different direction. They dropped 2 Burst Lightnings, 2 Stock-Ups, and then 2 Mountains, and the 4 Slickshot Show-Offs. So like we see in Best of 1, and a lot of times in Best of 3, the Slickshot Show-Offs are a little bit prone to getting disrupted by people bringing in more interaction. And so this one is a little bit more mid-rangey, if you will, and is pretty good at going wide because of the bringing in the Drake Catcher. So we're dropping a Spell Pierce as well, and one of the Thundering Falls, which is the Surveil land, if I remember correctly. So then we're bringing in a Braid. This is good for the mirror match against other Quarry Steel Cutter decks. We've also got 2 Torch the Towers for interaction and exiling problematic sticky threats. You also have 2 copies of This Town Ain't Big Enough, which being able to bounce things and being able to recast them has worked pretty well for double spelling in this archetype. And then we have 2 of the Thunder Trap Trainers, which help us dig and kind of give us additional resources. And then we've got the 3 copies of the Drake Hatcher, and this is really good in the mirror match. So best of 3 right now, the most common deck that you're bumping into in the tournament scene is Izzet Prowess. And so if you're anticipating that matchup, the Drake Hatcher works particularly well. And so we're bringing in 2 more islands to kind of reflect those changes. And the best of 3 sideboard also got a little bit of a rework, so we're dropping 2 Torch the Towers in the sideboard because we brought 2 into the main. We're also dropping 1 Pyroclasm, which can kind of help reset go wide boards. I like bringing in the Drake Hatchers though, and it makes the Pyroclasms worse. So if we're seeing more Drake Hatchers, you're going to see a drop in Pyroclasm. Witchstalker Frenzy got dropped, which some people like to combine with the Screaming Nemesis, which is there were 2 copies last week that also got dropped. So those kind of are a paired group that can punish decks that don't have a way of punishing the Screaming Nemesis plus Witchstalker Frenzy combo. And then we have 2 copies of the Disdainful Stroke, and Disdainful Stroke is good for anything that is mana value 4 or greater. Wow, I know, right? But it's a classic one to bring in against like Zur and the Domain decks, cards of that nature, right? It's also good against the Shiko decks to an extent. Jeskai Control. We got 1 Rebel Salvo. This one, affinity for equipment, gets cheaper if you're playing more of the Quarry Steel Cutters, and is able to remove problematic blockers like the Shieldred the Apocalypse, anything with 5 toughness. We've also got Lithomantic Barrage, which is good against any of the blue and white decks, so good against Jeskai Oculus and good against Esper Pixies. And then we've got a 1 Stock Up, and worse off against aggro, better off if you're trying to dig for additional resources. And then 1 Fresh Start. And I think the Fresh Start is really nice for eliminating, like, Screaming Nemesis comes to mind. There's other targets as well that you want to make sure that they lose all of their abilities. As you'll see that there is also the Unable to Scream is being included as a one-of to kind of get rid of the creatures with problematic abilities. All right, and if you're a fan of the channel, we've been talking about Azorius Artifacts for a couple of weeks now in the Best of 1 and in the Meta Breakers on Sundays, and we finally see Azorius Artifacts take down a number 2 spot in the Standard Challenge. So this was Azorius Artifacts by Disc Bay Wolf. Took down 2nd place on May 9th, and it's the first time that we've talked about it, sort of, right? Officially in Best of 3. So the card that's really kind of bringing new attention to the Azorius Artifacts build is the United Battlefront, which kind of works like a collected company if your deck is built with enough non-creature and non-land permanent cards with mana value 3 or less. And the name of the game is how many times can you hit the Simulacrum Synthesizer. This one's also running the Kyla's Reconstruction, which is able to hit cards like the Simulacrum Synthesizer. Repurposing Bay is able to march its way up to Simulacrum Synthesizer by using your 2-drops like the Iron Crag, the Spring-Loaded Saw Blades, and Clay-Fired Bricks. We also have a Candy Trail instead of the Market Gnome, and we see this from time to time, being able to give you life stabilization as well if you aren't hopping it up in down the line. High Noon is a really good inclusion for this deck, in my opinion, because your cards that are already allowing you to kind of get multiple triggers off of the Simulacrum Synthesizer allows you to put multiple pieces of cardboard onto the table on 1 turn, even though you are only casting 1 spell each turn. And High Noon completely destroys certain strategies like the Quarry Steel Cutter and Izzet Prowess. Perilous Snare then is removal that works with the Simulacrum Synthesizer, same with the Braided Net. Cryptic Coat gives you something that you can bounce to your hand and re-trigger the Simulacrum Synthesizer over and over, as well as giving you an unblockable creature. And then we have the Thousand Moon Smithy, which gives you kind of a little bit of that late game reach. If the game is going super long, you can get some value out of your Thousand Moon Smithy by whenever you're casting things, getting gnomes that create XX gnomes that are equal to the power of the artifacts that you have. So the Best of 3 sideboard, we have the Authority of the Consuls for against aggro, Disdainful Stroke against domain, Negate against domain, or Jeskai Control, any of the control archetypes. Stonebrain against Azorius combo, Azorius Omniscience, Get Lost for enchantment and Planeswalker hate, Rest in Peace for against the Jeskai Oculus and Azorius Omniscience, anything that cares about the graveyard, and then 4 copies of the Temporary Lockdown if you're coming up against that Quarry Steel Cutter deck. All right, so we're going to have 2 Friday tournaments. So first place on the 2nd tournament on of the Standard Challenge on May 9th was taken down by Izzet Prowess by Captaino CL. And if we compare this one to last week's list, we see that they also dropped a Burst Lightning, 2 of the Slickshot Show-Offs instead of all 4, and 1 of the Spell Pierce and a Thundering Falls. So similar drops to what we saw before. This one's running an island. It's bringing in 1 Torch the Tower instead of 2. It's bringing in an additional into the Flood Maw, as well as only 2 Drake Hatchers. but similar to what we saw with C-Max list, right? Slight variation. We see that Torch the Tower has been moved from the side to the main. We've dropped 2 copies of Screaming Nemesis, so not doing that either. However, we are still holding on to the Witchstalker Frenzy in case we come up against a Shieldred. And then we also have the 2 copies of the Sunspine Lynx have been dropped for against Domain and Esper Pixie. And instead we're bringing in the Disdainful Stroke. So kind of across the board, we're seeing more Disdainful Strokes being included. Ral Crackling Wit is also being brought in. This one's a good one if your opponent is running white sweepers. And we also have the 4th copy of Into the Floodmaw, which helps out against the aggro strategies. We have the 1 copy of Unable to Scream, which is kind of the alternative that I was talking about, where if you have something that has an annoying ability, Unable to Scream is the answer. And then we have the 3rd Drake Hatcher in the sideboard, so you can bring that in if you are up against the mirror match. Second place on Friday was taken down by Izzet Prowess by CMAC with the same exact list that they used on the earlier Friday tournament, so we won't be covering that one, but does showcase you just how good the Izzet Prowess archetype has been in the standard challenge. First place on Saturday's tournament, May 10th, was Azorius Omniscience by Saley J03. And if we compare this one, we have to go all the way back to week 4 of Aether Drift. And it's not to say Azorius Omniscience hasn't been there, it just hasn't been snagging one of the top 2 spots. So we do see a couple of changes from Aether Drift. Obviously, this is more towards the Meringue River Agent build. So we're dropping 2 copies of the Confounding Riddle, and we're dropping an island. We're also dropping all 3 copies of the Chart of Course. We're dropping 4 copies of the Flagi Archaeologist. Best of 3 doesn't have to worry about as much of mono red, so Flagi Archaeologist isn't as important. We're dropping the 3 copies of the Invasion of Arcavios because this deck functions without a sideboard, and that's the benefit of running this list, is that it frees up spots in your sideboard to be better suited for best of 3. We're also dropping the 3 copies of the Picklock Prankster. Even in best of 1, we've seen people kind of moving away from that because it can't hit the Invasion of Arcavios and etc. So this one, we're bringing in a Fabled Passage, bringing in 2 copies of Spell Pierce, bringing in a full playset of the Temporary Lockdown, which is pretty common, especially with how prevalent the Izzet Prowess deck is. And then we are running the single copy of the Founding the Third Path. If you haven't bumped into this loop, the whole point is to get 2 Meringue River Regents and be able to play the Founding the Third Path and mill your opponent out. It's kind of the main win condition of this deck. We're also bringing in the 4th copy of this Afara's Dispersal, helps stabilize against aggro matchups. The 4th copy of Stock Up to help us dig into our combo, because like I mentioned, the invasion, the Meringue River Agent one can stall out and not continue its loop. And then we have 4 Roiling Dragonstorms, which replace the Chart of Course in the Azorius Omniscience, being able to get the Omniscience into your graveyard so you can bring it back with a Baleo's Awakening on turn 4. Still business as usual. The Dragonstorm then going back to your hand whenever you're cycling with your Meringue. Whenever you play a Meringue River Regent, it bounces your Dragonstorms, which helps you dig through your deck for the loop. So the best of 3 sideboard, we're getting rid of all 3 Grand Abolishers, which is the double white card that can silence your opponent's ETBs and such. As I mentioned, this one's not using the Invasion of Arcavios, so we got rid of the Heroic Reinforcements, Johann Stopgap, Season of Weaving, any of the cards that were involved in the loop. And we're also dropping the Temporary Lockdowns because we've moved them from the sideboard to the main. And we're dropping the 3 Riptide Gearhulks, which was an alternative. If your opponent was good at shutting down the graveyard, then you could bring in the Riptide Gearhulks to kind of just prowess off and have an alternative win condition. So now we've got the, 3 copies? 2 copies of the Kutzil Flanker. This one allowing us to have Graveyard Hate for in the mirror match. We also have a Day of Judgment for wrathing our opponent. We have 2 Bezas for helping stabilize against aggro. We have 2 Overlord of the Mistmoors, which also help against stabilizing against the go wide strategies. And then we have 2 Voice of Victory, and this one helps out against any deck that is planning on playing spells on your turn, and looking at Jeskai control basically. And then we have 2 copies of the Clarion Conqueror. And what's nice about this one is it kind of answers your Ghost Vacuums. So if your opponent is leaning on the artifacts to have an answer to wiping the graveyard, the Clarion Conqueror then stops that in its tracks. All right, second place on May 10th was taken down by Orzhov Self-Bounce, or Orzhov Pixie, by Ruby Exilia, a name that we should be familiar with if you've paid attention to the Standard Challenge. And this is kind of a new archetype, sort of, right? We've talked about it again during Meta Breakers and Best of One, but this is the first time that we're seeing it in take down a number 1 or number 2 spot in the Standard Challenge. It's a very similar list to what we've seen before. Creature of the Schism helps out against like the aggro matchups. We've seen some people run a full copy of the Unholy Annex. Kind of depends on what you're anticipating. Unholy Annex is worse off if your life total is a problem. It does, although, kind of throw a wrench in the system. If you're playing like against mono red, they don't have the ability to hit 6 toughness most of the time. But it's significantly worse against something like Into the Floodmaw for Quarry Steelcutter decks or Izzet Prowess, because they just bounce the token, right? So this is better against the strictly red deck, worse off against Izzet Prowess. Whereas the Preacher of the Schism, you know, I hope that explains kind of the decision between Unholy Annex and Preacher of the Schism. Probably not my best. But we've got Temporary Lockdown, which helps out against the Izzet Prowess decks. Lorn of the Third Path as well, to hate on artifacts or enchantments. We've got the whole name of the game of the Orzhov Self-Bounce is how much value can we get out of the Temporary Lockdowns. So we can play things like our Hopeless Nightmare, Momentum Breaker, Nowhere to Run, all of which get wiped by the Temporary Lockdown, and then when we bounce the Temporary Lockdown, get additional ETBs again. Same with the Tiny Bones Joins Up, kind of gives us like a 5th copy of the Hopeless Nightmare to hate on our opponent's hand. This is a very similar build to what we saw Sonio build like a month ago. And then, in fact, actually, I think it might be that list. Can't remember if Liliana was in there instead of Shieldred. But anyway, we've got the 4 copies of the Nurturing Pixie, and to bounce our Temporary Lockdown, same with the Sun Pearl Kirin. Beza helps out stabilize against aggro, same with Shieldred the Apocalypse, and then Unholy Annex helps us dig into additional threats to continue answering our opponents 1-for-1. In the sideboard, we've got Exercise, which gives us the Artifact and Enchantment hate. We've got Get Lost for Enchantment and Planeswalker hate, Rest in Peace for Graveyard hate, Kutzel's Flanker for Graveyard hate, Duress for additional hand hate, Lorn of the Third Path if we want to hate on artifacts and enchantments. Alinda, Saint of Dusk, is hexproof from instances. So certain decks are just trying to answer with instances. If you can catch them off guard, you can win with Alinda. And then Unholy Annex, the 3rd copy. If it's a favorable matchup and we're not feeling too pressured and they don't have bounce, we can bring in the Unholy Annex, or the 3rd copy. All right, and the third Izzet Prowess that we'll talk about is by Angels Jeffrey, and took down 1st place on Sunday's tournament on May 11th. And if we compare this one to C-Max list, we can see that they dropped an Island, they dropped the 2 This Town Ain't Big Enoughs, they dropped the 2 Thunder Trap Trainers, as well as the 2 copies of the Burst Lightning, to bring in a 3rd copy of Torch the Tower, the 3rd copy of Into the Floodmaw, and the 3 copies of, a full playset of the Drake Hatcher. We're also bringing in a full playset of the Stock-Ups, as well as 2 Mountains. So leaning fully into the Drake Hatcher, anticipating the mirror match. And the best of 3 sideboard, we can see that they dropped a Lithomantic Barrage for Esper Pixie and Domain. We see that they also dropped a Sunspine Lynx for Esper Pixie and Domain. We also dropped 1 Ghost Vacuum for Jeskai Oculus and Azorius Omniscience. And we dropped an Abrade for the mirror match. We also dropped the Fresh Start, which this one's using the Unable to Scream. So we've got the 3 copies of the Slickshot Show Off in the sideboard. And I kind of like this one, because if you're not coming up against a deck that has a whole bunch of X2 hate, then the Slickshot Show Off can help increase the speed or the clock of the deck. But it is a little bit matchup specific. The Ral Crackling Wit is a really good one to bring in if they are having temporary lockdowns, which this deck can struggle with. And then, as I mentioned, the Unable to Scream, if they have a creature with a problematic ability, this is a good, an easy one to use if they have something like the Screaming Nemesis. All right, and we made it to the 15th list for this week, and it is a 4th copy of Izzet Prowess. So there is a fair amount of Izzet Prowess in the best of 3 meta, I will admit. But there are answers to it as well. It's not all 8, right? 5 out of 8 is up there though, right? So maybe we have a little bit of a problem on our hands. So if we compare this one to Captain OCL's list, which is what it's closest to, we can see that they dropped the single Torch the Tower to bring in the 4th copy of the Burst Lightning, and the rest of the list is the same. And then in the best of 3 sideboard, we can see that they dropped 1 copy of the Disdainful Stroke, 1 Abrade for the Artifact Hate, 1 Witchstalker's Frenzy, because this one's not running any of the Screaming Nemesis, and then dropped the Unable to Scream, and instead is bringing in 2 copies of the Rebel Salvo, so the card that gets cheaper for the Quarry Steelcutter and can get rid of problematic blockers. And you know, Drake Hatcher, it's pretty good. Dealing 5 to it makes it so that they can't just answer with the Prowess pump off of 1 spell. So this kind of helps with the surgence in Drake Hatchers that we're seeing, as well as other problematic blockers. And then we also are seeing the Sunspine Links return, right? So this one keeping both copies for Esper Pixie and Domain. So I hope that kind of helps you get acquainted with the best of 3 meta as well as the best of 1 meta. If you have any comments or any questions, please feel free to leave them down below. I do my best to answer each one. If you liked this sort of thing and want to say thank you, the best way to do that is by becoming a YouTube member. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the community deck tech, which if you are a YouTube member, you will get priority for. And yeah, I hope you're doing well. I hope you are enjoying the meta, and I hope you are doing well in your RCQs and enjoying, climbing the Magic the Gathering arena ladder. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and I will catch you all tomorrow.